So, welcome to this webinar called Walk the Talk, Carbon Emission Calculations, which is an AFRY webinar discussing COP26 insights, different calculations frameworks, and real-life examples. My name is Anna-Karin Jönbrink, and I am a market area manager for sustainability in Sweden. And I'm happy to introduce this webinar, and I'm really happy that we have so many registered participants here. You are more than welcome, everybody. First of all, some practical details. We will record this webinar it's important for you to know. And this recording will be available somehow afterwards. We have not yet really decided, but it will be available later on. We at AFRY, we are more than 16,000 devoted consultants working in more than 40 countries within our 4 divisions: infrastructure, industrial and digital solutions, process industries, energy and management consulting. And our mission is to accelerate the transition towards a sustainable society. And that is done by cooperation between us and our clients. And here you see a slide where we describe that there are so many things to consider when it comes to sustainability and sustainable solutions. And we at AFRY, we can provide them all. And now we will go through some of them just very roughly. So please. As a company or an organization, you have to consider regulations and demands coming from authorities, but also from your clients. Then you have to use governance in order to ensure that you fulfill all these things. And then the key for today is assessment and calculations. You need to assess and calculate in order to ensure that you know your performance when it comes to climate, which will be the focus today, but also when it comes to sustainability or environment. And there are a lot of different assessment methods, but today, as we said, we will focus on climate. When you know your performance, then you can report it through different kind of frameworks or systems. And that's also, of course, very important to describe your performance. It can be on an organizational level or on a product level. For example, the environmental product declarations, which is based on Lifecycle Assessment, or other systems where you more describe your organization or your system. All these things are important, but even more important is the improvement. We heard from COP26 and from not least from youngsters such as Greta Thunberg, but also the youth panel within AFRY, that the key now is to stop just talking. We need actions. And action means improvement. And there are many, many ways to improve from sustainability or climate point of view. And for us at AFRY, there is where please go back, Saskia. It's where we work together, where the sustainability consultants work in deep cooperation with the technical consultants or different kind of experts. So by helping each other, we can really provide those sustainable solutions. Thank you. And now the agenda today is, first we will start to get some insights from COP26. Then we will talk about organization and how to calculate the sustainability or the climate performance of an organization. After that, we will have a little introduction of how to calculate from a product point of view using lifecycle assessment. And then at the end of this webinar, we will have a panel discussion where we will invite some more experts from within AFRY who will discuss with you different issues we have provided. But there will also be an opportunity for you to raise during the webinar some questions or issues you want us to raise at the panel discussion. And you can do that by using the chat for the webinar. We will, since you are so many, we cannot promise to raise all the questions, but we will hopefully be able to pick some of them at least. Before leaving the floor, I also would like to tell you that we will today have an integration with you, and that will be done using Mentimeter. So I suggest that you pick up your mobile phone or another device than the one you are looking at for the webinar, and get it prepared so that you can answer the Mentimeter questions. And before leaving, I also want to tell you who is here today. So our speakers today are Saskia Gold from Germany, Christine Fransson and Marcus Olofsgård, senior climate calculations experts, myself. And then we have Riccardo Traverso, who is a sustainability and climate change expert from Italy. And then we have Susanna Kiviniemi from Finland, who is also a climate calculation expert. So we really hope that we can provide you the international view of how to do these calculations and how to use them for improvements, because action is the key now. And I really hope that you will enjoy this webinar. And I know that perhaps not all of you will stay to the end. We really encourage you to contact us, and here are the contact details. So if you want to come in contact with us on these issues or other issues, please feel free to contact us. And now I give the floor to Saskia. Please, Saskia, tell us more about your insights from COP26.
Hi, I'm Saskia and I am a sustainability consultant based in Munich. And 2 weeks ago, I was in Glasgow at the COP26. And today I want to summarize the main insights from the event for you. So the overall aim, what the Conference of the Parties decided, was that we are going to try to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. To do that, we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions globally by at least 50%. Oh, why is 2 seconds? Here we go. We need to decrease our greenhouse gas emissions by at least 50% by 2030 and net zero by 2050. So 2030, that's 9 years to go, so that's not a long time. But for that, they have the Global Methane Pledge. So that's 100 countries decided to cut down their collective methane emissions by at least 30% by 2030 compared to 2020 levels. That's important because methane is a stronger greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, but it doesn't stay as long. So if we cut down our methane emissions now, we kind of get a bit of a time frame to decide on our long-term CO2 reduction measures. Another aim was the end of deforestation until 2030, which is great news, but it requires money. But the parties decided to provide $100 billion of adaptation finance annually from developed countries to developing countries for mitigation and adaptation measures for climate. Another thing that they talked about a lot was carbon pricing, which was tricky because we are kind of trying to get an international currency going for every country agrees to. But they've been discussing rules for accounting and transferring emission reduction credits. This kind of leads over to the reporting frameworks as well. And the one thing that every country agreed to was that we need some mandatory climate reporting and international standards as well. 2 of these standards are the TCFD, which is the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, where the UK, for example, started, they're going to in next April 2022. It's now legal for about 1,200 companies, the biggest companies, but a lot of other countries agreed to the TCFD reporting framework as well. The EU is concentrating more on the CSRD, which is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And I think we could do a whole other webinar about all the different reporting frameworks and standards that are coming up now everywhere. But overall, the aim is that we are going to have some global standardized reporting framework that we can work with. And another, maybe the biggest news that was kind of mostly in the news was that 40 countries agreed to phase out coal until 2030. So that's for the developed countries, and 2040 for the developing countries. This was something as well that you've heard a lot outside the green zone and the blue zone, because there's loads of protests going on. There was up to 100,000 people in Glasgow demonstrating for fast actions. And one of the pledges they were asking for was the exit of coal. But today, the webinar is about greenhouse gas calculations, and a lot of the things that we've just heard, all these pledges, are drivers for CO2 calculations and greenhouse gas calculations. The first one is duty of care. So duty of care is a legal term that means that we can sue our governments if they don't meet their promises for kind of climate action. But to do that, we need to be able to quantify the progress of these pledges. So if they say they reduce their emissions by X until 2030, what does that mean in 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, 8 years? And that's where CO2 calculations come in place. The other thing is the climate reporting, where we do need CO2 calculations, carbon pricing. We need to calculate how much do companies compensate, how much do they pay for, etc. And then obviously the global methane pledge. So this is like just the drivers that I identified from the COP26 for the CO2 calculations. But we know that there are a lot of other drivers out there, and we have a lot of participants today that are here because they're interested in CO2 calculations. So we kind of want to ask you if you could tell us what you think are the drivers for CO2 calculations. So if you go to menti.com and then type in the code 25008319, so that's in the top of the screen, 25008319, and just put in a few words that you associate with drivers for CO2 calculations, we'll get a nice overview of why are CO2 calculations important. Here we go, the first answers are coming in. Quantify the improvement, to know your impact. Performance measurement, a lot about the measurement side, we will talk about that later. Sustainability, so that's a broad one. Corporate social responsibility, future generations, detecting inefficiencies. I think I like that one because that's going more into the actually doing the improvements, what Anna Karan said beforehand. Transparency, I see a few times here, which I think is really important as well as a kind of communication tool, which we've seen at the COP as well, that there could have been a bit more communication from inside the blue zone to the people outside in Glasgow. Reporting is getting bigger. So I think we'll just wait another minute, Marcus, maybe? I feel like we've got like 29 people answering here. Our word cloud is getting bigger and bigger. What are the words that are standing out for you, Marcus?
I think it's interesting, the balance of gaining internal knowledge, communicating, and using it for improvements. I think that's three interesting areas that it's nice to see that all of them are covered. Yeah.
Okay, we'll keep this going in the background, and we'll have the full word cloud, and we'll send that to you after the webinar, but we will continue our presentation now. So floor to Marcus.
Thank you, Sashka. There. I will start out with a bit of calculations for on an organizational level, greenhouse gas calculations. When I started about 10, 15 years ago with this. There was also technical issues at that time. This was the saying that we often used: what gets measured gets managed. After been working for 5-6 years with it, I realized that this was certainly not true. You can measure and measure and measure for a very long time without actually doing any managing at all. But what is true that if it doesn't get measured, it does certainly not get managed. So the conclusion moving forward then became what gets measured can be managed. And that's kind of the balance I want to introduce here today, or not introduce, but emphasis here today, that you need to take the measurements into management as well, and you need to see that the purpose of measuring is to manage your emissions. What? Here, as I said, as you saw in the agenda, there are two main areas on how you can calculate your greenhouse gas emissions. You can either do it on a product level or on an organizational level. And Christine will talk about more the product level later on, and I will dig a little bit deeper into the organizational level here. There is one very established framework when calculating your organizational greenhouse gas emission, and that's the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is illustrated here in this picture. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol aims to take the entire emissions that your organization can be associated with and try to calculate them in as good way as possible to make sure that you put the effort in the right place when doing your reduction. It's basically divided into 3 scopes. You have scope 1, which is your direct emissions from your own chimneys, your own end pipes, emissions that you can have within your own facilities. Pretty much easy to measure, I wouldn't say easy to manage, but it's, you know what you need to do. Scope 2 relates to bought energy, indirect emissions from bought energy such as electricity or heat, for instance. That's also something a lot of people has been working with for a very long time, trying to make more energy efficient facilities, more energy efficient production chains. And here we can see that that work shows up in scope 2, your indirect emissions. The large part and the things that most organizations have issues with and troubles with and challenges is the scope 3 emissions. You have the indirect emissions from your organization, and that's through your entire value chain, from materials to other services you buy, to waste management, to business travel, and then use of your product, end of life of your product, all the way to how you invest your money. There's been calculations done to suggest that if we include scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions from all companies or organizations, we account for between 85 and 90% of the global total emissions. So in this way, it's very, it covers the whole picture. When talking about greenhouse gas calculations, there are a lot of mostly 3-letter abbreviations, but also other names of frameworks and concepts that are getting thrown around. I would just like to try to give you an overview on how they are related and how they can be used. In the line at the top, the blue circles that relate to Greenhouse Gas Protocol, that's basically the framework for the calculations. It was introduced in the early century, and then it has developed over time until now. We see that in 2010, there was a more definitive way to calculate scope 3 emissions. There was a guidance on scope 3 emissions. These more value chain based emissions. There also was a demand for calculation framework for cities and communities. If we have a municipality that wants to become carbon neutral, how do we calculate these kinds of emissions? And when the calculation frameworks evolves, also different frameworks for reporting, setting targets, developing strategies and management strategies evolves based on those calculation frameworks. We can see we early on had the GRI and CDP reporting framework, GRI as a sustainability reporting framework, and CDP as a carbon disclosure project where you could report your emissions and your management to reduce those emissions. Later on came the Covenant of Mayors, trying to manage the greenhouse gas emissions from cities and municipalities. And from 2015 and forward, we have seen science-based targets, the exponential roadmap, and now the latest, the net zero standard and science-based targets. Frameworks that are much more focused in setting targets, management, getting the reduction. So we can see there's been quite a journey from over a 10-year period where the frameworks had a large focus on calculating, reporting, and the last 5 years, the focus has been much more on managing and actually getting the reduction done. So, based on this, I would like to know which kind of GHG calculations and reporting frameworks have you sitting here today been using so far, or have you been in contact with? You can see the suggestions here below. You have another Menti code here, you can see it. Interesting. We can see that there is Lifecycle Assessment is still in the lead, so so far you can assume that it's been a product focus among our participants. It's also nice to see we have at least some science-based targets. Yeah. Nice. I will move forward, trying to give you some examples just to exemplify the outcomes and the challenges when doing these kinds of calculations. Sorry. Earlier last year, we did a project together with Arcticum and Urban Island, two other consultancy firms, for the island of St. Helena. St. Helena has a net zero target. It has a high ambition without definition, is our initial conclusion, because the concept of net zero wasn't really defined. What do we mean by net zero, and where do we stand today? So AFRY started to conduct baseline calculations for the island of St. Helena. And the advantages when you do greenhouse calculations for an island is that the system boundaries are very well defined for the island. It's where the water starts. So basically we used the global protocol for community scale greenhouse gas inventories. And then we can see if we just looked at the territorial emissions, and that would, for an organization or a company, relate to scope 1 and 2, basically their own emissions and emissions related to energy production, the emissions that you have more or less direct possibility to affect. And in this case, all the energy is produced on the island, so it's really not any difference between the two. So we see, to no one's surprise, that the main emission sources here, we had stationary energy and transportation. We also had some emissions from waste and from the local agriculture. And these are things that can be managed in a very concrete way. You can change your fuel sources, your energy productions system, and have a better waste handling system. But if we added the colors in the bars are actually just division between, for instance, transportation is public transport and private transport and boat transport. Stationary energy is different energy sources on the island. But in this case, I thought that the total sum was the most interesting, because we also had the opportunity when working with an island to see the consumption based. Then we used the import data, since all the products that gets imported to the island will be registered at customs with different codes, and you can using so-called spend analysis, you could assign certain emission factors to certain kind of goods. And then we realized that if you include production and consumption, that means outside the island, the other sources got rather small. In this step, we also included the emission from boats actually going to the island, flights landing on the island. And this, here you can see that scope 3 emissions are basically bigger than all the other emissions put together. And this is a challenge because the consumption and production is harder to manage from St. Helena's point of view. If we take a smaller example, we did a project for a manufacturing industry in Sweden. They are producing ventilation equipment for large buildings. And we can see here that we have even bigger differences. If you look at their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, that's from own emissions from company cars and electricity and heat. They are rather small when you compare it to the scope 3 emissions that are, in this case, huge. And they are big because you include the use of the product, which is the energy use of the product. And if it's a ventilation equipment, it will use energy, but also it relates to their core business of doing more energy efficient ventilation equipment. Since scope 3 usually is the largest impact, it's also very important to get good numbers on it. These figures does not include biogenic CO2 emissions at this stage. And they are also market-based generally for energy. But what you can see here, that is, it's important to get good numbers on it, but it's also really difficult. At least when you do this initial calculations, you need to go out for supplier data, you need to estimate how your product is used, you need to find a good end-of-life scenario for your product and to be able to assess that. And there are several different approaches. I mean, if you get supplier data that's of good quality, it's really great to use, but you often need to add some generic data from reliable databases. You could use the spend analysis, which I mentioned briefly earlier, where you just look what category of goods have we sold or have we put on the market, and what kind of emissions are typically associated with that kind of product. But the best way, I would say, is to use LCA-based data here. Because LCA, a lot of these headings you see under scope 3 are topics that are covered in a well-performed life cycle assessment. So you have the transport, you have the end-of-life scenario, you have the use of the product, and you have the ingoing goods and services within the product. And in that way, you can get a good overview of the order of magnitude of your scope 3 emissions. And Christine, I will let you talk a little bit more about the life cycle assessment part.
Thank you, Marcus. And as you all know, there are several other environmental challenges besides of climate change. And some of them have a very long time perspective and are global, like climate change and stratospheric ozone depletion. Other are regional, like acidification and water scarcity, while others, such as photochemical smog, are local. And the toxic substances, for instance, can be a challenge on both a local and a global level. And life cycle assessment is a tool that can capture several of these environmental challenges at the same time. And it's thus very useful to get a holistic view on total environmental impact of a product or service. So, what is life cycle assessment? In short, you can say that it's a standardized tool for investigating and understanding the environmental impacts of a product, a process, or a service. So if GHG calculations that Marcus talked about earlier is most suitable for organizations, LCA is better if you want to assess a specific product or a specific service. A complete LCA consists of all phases of a product's life cycle, and it includes extraction of raw materials, manufacturing of materials, components, and products, transports, use phase, and waste management. And this is what you call a cradle-to-grave LCA. It is also possible to include only a few life cycle phases, and The most common approach is the so-called cradle-to-gate LCA, in which the assessment often ends after manufacturing phase with a finished product ready to use. And when comparing the timeline of LCA to that of GHG calculations, you can see that the first LCAs, they were conducted already in the late 1960s. And after that, there's been a large focus on developing calculation methods and standardization frameworks. And since one very appealing use of LCAs is to compare different products or concepts with each other, it's important to have clear system boundaries and clear calculation rules, so you don't compare apples with pears. And this is, for instance, handled in the international EPD system for environmental product declarations, where you can find product category rules for several different products that sets boundaries on how to calculate and how to report environmental impact. Historically, LCAs has not been used so extensively for management and regulatory initiatives, but I think it's likely that LCA will play a larger role when the EU taxonomy is implemented, and also for the carbon border adjustment mechanism that will come in place soon. So what's an LCA useful for? And what I consider most important with an LCA is to actually make use of both the results and of the study itself. One positive outcome that almost everyone conducting an LCA experiences is that you learn more about your product or process. And by that, you can identify environmental hotspots on which you can focus your product and process development on. And you can also contribute to decrease the environmental impact for those hotspots. Another use for LCAs is to compare different materials or products or processes with the same function. One example of that is that today many companies want to assess how the environmental impact from their products is affected by, for example, a change of plastics from fossil plastics to recycled or bio-based plastics. Another example that I've been working with is a company who makes textile products with a specific function. And they wanted to examine different types of textiles in order to decrease the total environmental impact from their products, while still maintaining the function. And for that, they used LCA and made an eco collection of their textile products. Some other companies, they want to describe and communicate the environmental impact of their products externally, for instance, in marketing or on demand from customers. And for those companies, an environmental product declaration, an EPD, is a very good option, since there are product category rules on how to calculate for different product categories, and they also have to do an external third-party review to verify the study. And finally, another use for LCAs is to be a basis for decisions. And this can be both on a company level and on a societal level. For instance, I recently conducted an LCA for a company that wants to apply for a permit for a large power generating industry, since that was a request from the authorities in that specific country in order for them to be allowed to build that industry. And the results from the LCA showed that the environmental impact would probably be too high for them to get the permit. So now they are working on some changes in the process and the raw material input in order to decrease emissions before actually building the factory and before applying for the permits, so that they will be able to get it at all. Yeah. So, as a real-life example, I would like to share this LCA study that I made for the company Villeroy & Boch. And they produce, for instance, mixers and thermostats, and they want to make EPDs, environmental product declarations, for several products, starting with 2 lead-free series. That's called Atlantic and Nautic. And the products are kitchen mixer, wash basin mixer, and thermostat. And why did they want to make LCAs? They had several reasons for that. And the main reason for them was that they want to make EPDs for the products. And they want to do that in order to meet coming legal demands at least in Sweden, for climate declarations on construction materials. And they also see an increasing interest and demand from business-to-business customers on getting trustable and quantified environmental information regarding products. And in parallel with the LCAs, Willer & Bock in Sweden has been working on their sustainability strategy. And they thought that the LCAs could be used for setting quantitative targets for improvement and also for future products and production processes. And a third aim of the study was to identify environmental hotspots regarding product raw materials and manufacturing. And they wanted to do that in order to get suggestions for future improvements. So, what about the results? First, the studies resulted in EPDs for products, and they will very soon be published. And second, the LCAs functioned as input to the sustainability strategy. So they could set up targets on continuous improvements, on quantitative targets on environmental impacts from products. And third, results from the LCAs was presented to some strategic persons at Willer & Bock, who are working with, for instance, product development, production processes, and marketing. And the results will function as an input to the product development. And one result of the study was that the raw materials has larger impact than the manufacturing, waste management, and transports. And you can also see that raw materials in category 3, that stands for a very large share of the total weight of the product, stands for a large share of the environmental impact for the products. So now product developers are focusing on decreasing input of a specific material for the category 3 components to decrease environmental impact and put effort on things that can make the most difference. So I think that this LCA has been a very interesting journey, and it feels good to see that the results from the LCA are being used in so many different ways. And now, Marcus, you have another example.
Yes, I just wanted to address, I saw we had a question about how the LCA would relate to the cross-border adjustment mechanism. And since the basis of the mechanism that you don't want any carbon leakage, you want to make sure that products produced outside the union is less equal or less carbon intense than products within the union, then LCA would be the preferable tool to use that. Of course, we don't know, it's not decided, but it would be the logical choice in some kind of LCA calculations. Otherwise, as we have mentioned earlier, there are a lot of frameworks for calculation, reporting, management, but there are so far very little legal demands or sharp demands on certain performance that you need to be under this kind of greenhouse gas emissions. Where there are demands is in case when you apply for financing. For instance, from EU Innovation Fund, in this case, when we did the work for SECAB, it's more or less solely based on the potential that the project has to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And then you need to do these greenhouse gas calculations further on. But what we can see here is that while in the process of doing this greenhouse calculation for the application to the Innovation Fund, you can also evaluate the process and see if there are process changes as possible, and also possible other use of the byproduct from the process. An advantage here is that we were also a part of designing the process, and we will hopefully be a part of implementing the process further on, which made us understand the data, the incoming data for the analysis much better, and also be able to do better examples and better suggestions for improvements. And the second part of the EU Innovation Fund process, I'll leave back to you, Christine.
Yeah. Thank you. And for the applications to the EU Investment Fund, it was not only mandatory to perform GHG calculations, it was also mandatory to have them externally reviewed. And we did that for some of the other applications to the fund. And in this way, we could find both minor calculation errors and larger systemic misunderstandings and misinterpretations, and correct them and have discussions with the applicants before applications were submitted. And I think that resulted in improvements of the applications and also credibility. And also for LCAs, third-party review is required when you make an EPD, and it is strongly recommended in case you make a comparative LCA. And besides being a requirement in some cases, a review can also contribute to increase the credibility and robustness of your study. And my experience from being reviewed is that also you as a LCA practitioner gain a lot from being reviewed, and that an experienced reviewer can contribute to improve the LCA study a lot only by making small changes and comments. And now I will leave the floor to Anna-Karin again for the next section.
I'll just get in here in between and ask a question. We had a question in the chat how bigger projects like infrastructure project for the Swedish road agency, for instance, handles LCA and EPD. And in those kinds of projects, and for large building as well in Sweden now, there are demands on doing climate calculations on large projects. And when you don't have the possibility to gather specific data for all the components, then you can use the generic data and have a pretty simple model. But to be able to choose, to improve your performance, you want to choose products with better climate performance. And then the EPD could be a good proof of that. My concrete is better than the average concrete. My asphalt is a better choice. Look at this EPD. And then you can use the data from the EPD and LCA to get a competition advantage when trying to sell these products to such a project. Now, Anna.
Thank you for these interesting presentations. I hope that you all learned a lot. At least I did, even if I learned these things earlier. There are always new things to hear. And I hope that you liked it. Now we want to change slide to the panel discussion, because now it's time for the panel to join and to also for you to have some discussions with this. So now I'd like to first of all introduce Susanna Kiviniemi and Riccardo Traverso. First, we take ladies first. Susanna, who is you? Who are you? Sorry.
Yes, I'm Susanna Kiviniemi and I'm from AFRI Finland. And I have 10 years experience in the CO2 calculations. I've done different kind of calculations for industries and also smaller businesses. And also we've been doing a lot of roadmaps for decreasing the carbon footprints for clients.
Yeah. Thank you and welcome to the panel. And now I'd like to hear Riccardo. What about you? Who are you?
Thanks, Anna. I'm Riccardo Traverso. I'm an engineer with 20 years more or less of experience in sustainability and climate change areas, where I develop projects coming from both sustainability reporting and disclosure till the carbon footprinting and management system implementation for carbon emissions, so ISO 40064 and 40067 projects. So the application of this methodology for calculation the carbon footprint. So it's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for this involvement.
Yeah. Thank you, Riccardo, and welcome to the panel. And we will start the panel actually with asking a first question to the audience. And while you answer that one, we will let our internal panel give their view of it. So the first question is, what role will carbon emission calculations play in 2030? So please use the Menti and answer that one. I think it's the same code as earlier, 25008319. And I think that Saskia will take over the presentation shortly. But first, I want to hear from you. Shall we start with Susanna? What do you think about, what role do you think carbon emission calculations will play into 2030?
Yes, well, I'm hoping that all the companies and communities have started to calculate their CO2 footprints, and also that they do not only calculate it, but they have set goals to minimize their carbon footprint. So I think that is the most important part of the future, that everyone's aiming for the zero carbon.
Yeah. Thank you, Susanna. And then I'll ask Saskia, what do you think? What role do you think carbon emission calculations will play in 2030?
I would hope that CO2 calculations are kind of everywhere, and that the awareness, even like not just in companies but for the public, is going to increase as well, so that we have a bit of a feeling for like what does it mean, what is a ton of CO2, and I like to compare to kind of the dietary requirements on products, which like 20 years there was nobody knew what are kilocalories, but now they are in all products, and we can see what are the proteins, what are the carbs, etc. Where I would hope that like carbon calculations are everywhere in products, and we therefore get a feeling for what is carbon, like from the public.
And what about you, Ricardo?
Well, in my opinion, I believe that the increasing awareness and sensitivity on sustainability targets that companies need to respect will involve a wider and always deeper attention to how calculation of CO2 is made by companies and by operators. So the focus on fixing the sustainability targets in terms of CO2 reduction will need to be much more verified through external, for example, verification. And so the companies will need to have precise methodologies for calculate the CO2 emissions. So adhering, for example, joining the science-based target initiatives, for example, the initiative, for example, is just one of the examples, international examples that let me say, oblige companies to perform precise calculation in terms of CO2. So I think it's more strategic. Yes, the importance of CO2 calculation is becoming strategic for companies, also in terms of credibility and reputation. Yeah. So that's it.
Yeah, thank you. And then over to Sweden. It's now Marcus who will have the voice.
I would do the only certain way to not be correct in this kind of question. I'll just extrapolate the curve that I'm seeing now. For the last 10-15 years, we have seen that the calculations have developed from being extremely uncertain to being rather reliable and putting they are trustworthy and transparent in many areas. And when that continues, and the CO2 calculations will get even more precise and more accepted as a true scenario or the truth, then I also think there will be more incentives, more regulatory policy, more finance connected to the carbon or CO2 calculations, and they will be a criteria that most things will be evaluated accordingly.
Yeah. Thank you. So there is hope for carbon emission calculations as far as our experts see it. So what about the audience now? Saskia, could you please share what does the Menti say?
So we've got a few answers coming in. It's actually quite a few, and I think there's like some quite good comments here. Crucial to enable industry-wide CO2 pricing, reporting.
Decision making, I really love.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To reduce emissions, CO2 emission trading, regulations again.
Yeah.
I like this product info for customers. That is
Yeah.
quite-
Yeah.
I like the optimists that think it will be useless in 2030 because the problem is fixed.
Yeah.
Product for consumers, that's what I kind of like mentioned before, yeah.
And guidance for investors, that's also great.
And I think I saw like a unique selling point for tenders as well.
Yeah. So it's obvious that most of you think it's an important tool and that we really need to develop it and use it. So thank you very much for this first question. Now I think we should go to the next one. Do you share that slide, Saskia?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. So now we come to this about the tunnel vision. We are now very much focusing on carbon emissions, as we have been discussing earlier, and we know that there are other sustainability issues coming around the corner, and we see this difficulty with this tunnel vision, where we focus too much, perhaps. Even I think climate is extremely important, but I still like to have a glimpse on also the other things. We see many of them here, and from the 17 development goals, sustainable development goals, and others. But we also see like it's resources. I think, for example, when it comes to an engineering company like AFRY, that these raw materials extraction, and not least the rare earth metals, which are used in all these electric vehicles for batteries and other functions. I think that it's really important that we take care of all of them to ensure a long time sustainability in the long term. So I think that there are many more things important, and now we see that you are answering these, and I want you to get yeah, that was a question. I saw your question, but let's first take this one. So let us hear with our panel again. What do you think about how can we avoid tunnel vision, Saskia?
Well, I think it's like sustainability is always a step-by-step approach. So we start with something and then we see it's like what is working and what is not working. Because it's complex, we have to like network think, which often is harder than linear thinking. And so I feel it's a stakeholder interaction question. So we do our first step and then we interact with the stakeholders and with the community and ask, did this work well? Did this not work well? And I feel like that helps us to kind of keep all the different parts together and find out where are the problems and what is working well.
Yeah, thank you. And then I give the floor to Ricardo. Well,
in my opinion, I believe that sustainability must be included in the strategic view of the company. Only with this way, only with giving the right importance within the company, within the business, within the operations of the companies, we can avoid the risk of this, because giving a price, for example, to the CO2. So beside, for example, in every investment project that the company engage, beside considering as usual the various financial KPIs, also environmental KPIs need to be considered. So in that case, the CO2 calculations and the CO2 intensity calculation for each project would be a business as usual activity of the company. So by including this in the business as usual evaluation of companies, we can elevate the awareness on the sustainability topics to all levels within the companies. That's my opinion.
Thank you, Ricardo. And Susanna, what do you think?
Yeah, on my point of view, I think that industries are doing already like a wider scale, looking into this stuff like with the eutrophication or water impacts on water. At least in Finland, they have been doing. But what we can all the time improve these factors that we're looking into, and also take it from the industry world and take it to the community level and to the smaller businesses as well, where we can also focus more and more on different levels of sustainability. Yeah.
Thank you for taking this perspective. And then I ask Christine, what do you think?
Yes, and this is a question that I've been thinking of a lot since I used to work with chemicals management. And among people working with those issues, it's not obvious that climate is the largest threat to humanity. It's many who think that chemical risks can be larger, but much harder to assess and requires lots of knowledge. So I would say that, and there are also other issues like biodiversity and resource scarcity that you mentioned, Anna-Karin, that might be very crucial challenges for us in the future. So I think that one key here is to have competence in industries. And it would be something like Ricardo said, that you need to have sustainability competence, not only a function, you need competence on that function, someone who actually knows sustainability and can include different parts, like climate, like chemicals, like biodiversity, resources, human rights, etc., etc. So at least at large companies, competence is really important. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Christine. And then we give the floor to the audience. What do they say, Saskia?
So we have communication, self-education, open-mindedness. I think I like that. Evaluate overall the sustainability, have to include a wider section of things and have a wider perspective. And I'm just going to scroll down now. Sustainability strategy and targets. Studying trade-offs between each other and between each factor.
Yeah.
Choosing a broad impact and assessment method when performing an LCA that includes several impact categories, also considering economic and social LCA frameworks for a larger extent. And then including multiple disciplines to work on CO2 issues. Yeah.
I think that it seems as we all agree that it's necessary to take the holistic perspective to understand what is sustainability, and also to see when different goals are conflicting and how to deal with that. And we have to train and get some practice on that. And I agree with some people regarding these sustainability issues. I mean, I've been doing life cycle assessment. My first was 1994, so quite some time ago, and then it was kind of shaky. We didn't have data, we didn't have tools. We were like kind of learning very much. But over those years, more than 25 years since, we have learned a lot. We have nice databases, nice knowledge, much more knowledge. We have standards, we have tools, all these things in place. So now we know how to calculate many of the things. And I think that we have to consider all these other things also, how to avoid the tunnel vision. We need to learn and do things together. And as Christine said, we need competence. And as Ricardo said, we need to have KPIs sustainability KPIs in companies and in other kind of organizations in order to ensure that we reach sustainability in a good way. And I really think that we learned a lot from these discussions, and we see that I hope that you also have got some new thoughts today. And thank you for this. And now we are kind of only having the final ending left. So Saskia, could you please change to these final slides we have? We are reaching the end of our webinar, and I want to thank all of you for participating and contributing in different ways. I will end with some notes. First of all, I want to emphasize that you are all welcome to contact our experts, these sustainability experts described here, and of course other experts within AFRY. But you are more than welcome to contact us if you have any questions, if you have any requests, if there are things you want to discuss and learn, or whatever. Please feel free to contact us. We look forward to hear from you. And then I want to promote our next webinar. The next slide, Saskia, please. We will have another webinar, the 7th of December, on the issue of sustainable supply chain management. And I hope that you all are interested in learning more about that. And the last but not least important thing is that we want to create sustainable solutions all together, and it's about calculating, assessing, and working on the improvements. Do real thing. Go from words to action. And with that, I wish you good luck with going from words to action. Thank you very much from us at AFRY.